Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for making your time to attend this webinar series. This is the first webinar series on digital right and technology and human right by DTP's program. Before we begin, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Indri. I'm a proud DTP alumna, and now I'm teaching at the Catholic University of Atmajaya in Jakarta, and I would be facilitating these discussions and moderating these discussions. So for today's discussions, the topic would be human right, digital right, and AI. I think it's a timely discussion in regard to this topic, as especially in Southeast Asia regions as well as in other part of the globe. And for this topic, we are trying to focus on looking into how human rights and governance of AI will actually accommodate and also put human right into considerations in the adoption of technology and emerging technology, as well as perhaps we also touch upon the discussions about to what extent we can hold the corporate accountable in terms of human right and the adverse impact of human right, adverse impact of emerging technologies adoptions that they've developed and try to promote. So for these discussions, we have two distinguished speakers with us. First of all, we would like to start the flow of the discussion like will be like this. We would like to invite Nenden Sekar Arum, one of leader in human rights defenders in digital rights in Southeast Asia. She is currently the executive director of SAFENET, which stands for Southeast Asia Freedom of Expression Network. Uh, she is also based in Indonesia, previously worked as in the field of journalism and data analysis. She has worked before with various media outlets in Indonesia, and Nenden is also one of the DTP alumni. And then for the second speaker, later we're going to have David Mejia-Canales. He is a senior lawyer at Human Rights Law Center in Australia, and he represented HRLC, and recently he's introduced his report titled Right First Principle for Digital Platform Regulation to the federal government. So he will be helping us a lot in dealing about how to what extent the questions about corporate accountability and human rights in the emerging technology can be discussed. And he's actually a policy advisor in Commonwealth Parliament working on legal system reform and on justice issue impacting First Nation people in Australia. He played active role in campaign for Indigenous people rights at the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service in Sydney. So, without further ado, I would like first to invite Nenden to provide us with up-to-date situations from the ground on the situation of digital right and digital right promotions and advancement in Southeast Asia country. Nenden, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes to
Okay.
present your talk.
Okay,
Please.
thank you, Indri, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, DTPs, for inviting me for this important discussion. So it's an honor for me actually to have the opportunity to share about the insight and what's the current situation about the digital rights across the region. Because I focus on the Southeast Asia, mostly I will talking about that, but I believe it's also happening around the globe. So it should be like quite relevant with everyone's in this room. So I'll share my presentation. I'll talk mostly about what is actually digital rights situation and digital rights violations in on the ground. So it will lead us to what is actually we can do within the situation. So let me begin by introducing SAFENET. SAFENET is an organization based in Denpasar, Bali, Indonesia. We are working, we are committing committed to creating a digital space that respect and upholds human rights. So we have run several key programs, for example, monitoring and documentation and documenting digital rights violation. And then we do also victim support and incident handling. We do capacity building for civil society organization. And of course, doing solidarity with other CSOs across region and the globe. So what is actually digital rights that we believe? Actually, digital rights are the extensions of the human right, the existing human rights, but it's applied in the digital environment. So how we ensure that individual freedoms and protections in the online space. So they include, but not limited to, right to access to information and internet, right to privacy, online freedom of expression, and then rights to feel safe online. At least those 4 issues that SAFENET closely monitor and documenting all the situation. So if we talking about the situations in the region, I refer to Freedom on the Net, Internet Freedom Score. We can see that in Southeast Asia, digital rights are still under pressure. It's almost always under pressure. So we can see that almost all countries in the Southeast Asia, mostly partly free or not free. So there's no country that on the free category in Southeast Asia. So we can see like the governments in countries like Myanmar or Vietnam still impose a restriction and that significantly impact the internet freedom. So we can deep down after this, but this is the overview about what the situation looks in the Southeast Asia. That yeah, the situation is always partly free or not free. So this is the situation that as I mentioned earlier, that one of the digital rights that we advocate is the right to access the internet and the information. So when we see the internet shutdown or the other internet disruptions in the region, we've seen that as a digital rights violation. For example, there's a lot of like a internet shutdown, internet disruption that imposed during the election, protest, or periods of civil unrest. For example, in Myanmar, and then we can see internet blackouts everywhere that used to suppress resistance against the military regime. And also in Indonesia in 2019 and 2022, we can find that the internet ban in the Papua. So it's like totally blackout in Papua. So actually shutdown not only silence dissent, but also disrupt the communication, emergency services, and economic activities as well. So this is why we found that internet shutdown is the very blatant digital rights violation that we can see explicitly. And then the second one is about the digital and cyber attacks. Activists and journalists in the Southeast Asia actually face increasing threats from digital or various types of cyber attacks. So including hacking, phishing, even DDoS attacks that targeting websites for media independent or even the website for the civil society organization. So these attacks, even though we can confirm about who's behind these attacks, but it's mostly related to state-sponsored or backed by pro-government actors that aim to intimidate, discredit, and silence the critics from those activists or journalists. So in Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, many civil society organizations have reported such attacks, and then it's affecting their operation and safety as well. And then we can find how the government weaponized the law to suppress the freedom of expression. So this is the trend that actually we found in the at least in the past decade, on how the government used the laws to silence online speech. So they used the fake words like fake news, defamation, or even for the national security reason, on how they used to criminalize the dissent. So for example, in Indonesia, we have electronic information transaction law, and then in Thailand, we have the lesa majeste laws that usually used against social media user, activists, or even journalists. So this weaponized law is actually kills free expressions and discourage civic participation online. So this is one thing that we've seen also rise in the region. And then online censorship. So censorship in digital space is widespread in Southeast Asia. Websites are blocked, posts are taken down, and then we see that platforms are also pressured by the government to remove some contents. So government in Indonesia, for example, I can talk about Indonesia a lot, that government demands the platform like Meta, Facebook, Instagram, or X to take down some content then that categorized as offensive or threatening, even though we know that this content actually the criticism against the government. So this is actually beyond the legitimate moderation, but it seems that they are trying to control the narratives and also silencing dissenting voices. And then like actually just yesterday we also seen how archive.org, that we know that it's a really important website that preserves a lot of like internet memories, is also blocked in Indonesia. So we don't have we haven't got any justification about what actually the reason of about this blockage, but yeah, this is something that we usually seen like in the past few years in Indonesia. And then we also found a frequent data breach. So this is also a growing concerns in the region. So from the government database to the private sector's platform database, there's a lot of like incidents of sensitive data that being leaked or sold on the dark web. So it's really alarming actually, especially for the countries that have a weak data protection law. So mostly the victims is the citizen that really have a little, you know, like they don't have any power actually to do anything about this data leak, but they got a lot of like for example as a target for the telemarketing, even the data is used for some any other unconsensual activities online. So that's the thing. And then this is that we're talking about how the emerging technologies also become the challenge on the digital rights activism, for example, how AI and then spyware or the others emerging technologies also often used to surveil and targeting journalists, activists, or any other critical citizen. So this is something that we should look more on how the emerging technologies is supposed to be help us to make the to save or to make the situation safer. But then we've seen that there's a lot of like how the state sponsored surveillance is happening using this technology. So that's why maybe we should talking about more about how to regulate this emerging technology to ensure that it won't violate any digital rights. So the actors, as I mentioned, that a lot of like actors behind these situations, on, for example, state is mostly behind the internet shutdown, online censorship, and how they use legal framework itself. And then private corporation is also have their roles on how data exploitation of the users. They develop the surveillance tools, and then also they also have roles in online censorship or content moderation. And then, of course, cyber criminal, data breaches, cyber attacks, and the victims is always a citizen. Activists, HRDs, journalists, media, even youth and children is also become the victims of online censorship, surveillance, even the privacy violence itself. So the other challenges, I have like 4 more slides, but it will be short. So we can see that the trend is how the government is trying to push back against the activists. So this is become one of the biggest challenges actually that we've seen on the ground, how the authorities are using mix of legislation, digital surveillance, smear campaigns to intimidate and silence critics. So I mean, like there's a lot of like information operation that also being used by the government or state actors that stigmatize the activists, for example, that activists who against the government policy as a foreign agent, kind of. So it's happening how the government trying to stigmatize the activists or anyone who against their policy actually. And then we also find that the increment of digital security risk. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier about how the technology development or advancement is also playing roles on how the digital security it's the on how growing digital security threats as well that faced by individual or even the organization. And then big corporate business model, this is something that we should talk more on how actually big tech company are playing significant roles on how their business model actually make the digital space more vulnerable about the algorithm issues, about on how they're exploiting data and kind of and any kind of like a harmful business model that actually uh, it make the digital space more even shrinking as a civic space. And then of course technology advancement, AI, what else, quantum computing or anything, or it if it's not regulated well, I think it's become the biggest challenges as well on how the activists or even citizen exercising their rights on the digital space. So those challenges actually interconnected as well. So I think there's still a lot of like thing that become the challenges on how if there's no like the commitment from the government or the other actors to ensure that digital rights are respected, fulfilled, and enforced in the digital space as well. So I think I'll stop here, and then hopefully we will have more discussion later. So thank you, Mbak Indri. I'll give the time and screen for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Nenden, for a very touching presentation, yet very comprehensive. We've learned from Nenden that at least human rights defender in Southeast Asia country, across different countries in South Asia, face at least, I noted, 6 different form of threat and violations of digital rights. As Nandan already underlined, that digital rights simply, to put it simple, is the extensions of the protection of offline digital right into the online space. And by that, thinking about online space as a democratic space and open space for everyone to be able to exercise their right. And we know that from Nandan sharing that at least the threat is actually very systematic because it comprises of both physical attack in the infrastructure of the internet that enable people to actually get online, like blackout and internet shutdown, cyber attack, DDoS attack, and so forth, as well as try to combine it systematically with using a weaponized law, including the use of criminal sanctions, pressures, and criminal as well as administrative sanctions to the platform to be able to also serve the government purposes in controlling the online space. Such as Nandan said, it's being done through the introductions of stringent content moderations rules introduced by government across the country in Southeast Asia. So with that in mind, I would like to invite David to jump in to see the extent to which the development in the global level. We are talking about the initiative that recently being adopted by the UN, that is the digital UN Compact. To what extent that actually can address these kind of like situations, and what we can actually expect as right defenders in looking into employing that and see the opportunity that to address the current problem we are now facing. David, the floor is yours. Your time is 15 minutes, please. Also, those who are attending this discussion, please feel free to put the comment questions on the chat so we can actually read that loud and then being responded directly by the speaker. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much. And I'll get my slides up in just a moment, but I just wanted to, of course, just acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Gadigal country, which you might now, or you might know as Sydney, but this was and forever will be Gadigal country. And I also want to note in particular the attendance of Professor Tom Calmer, who is formerly of the Australian Human Rights Commission, who has done incredible work in advancing human rights, particularly for First Nations people. So a deep acknowledgement to you as well, Professor. Um, I don't feel that I need to explain to anybody, anyone here, the many benefits of being online. But of course, as we also know, there are many perils to being online. And I'm going to talk today about a potential solution, and I sort of bristle a little at the idea of it being framed as a solution in and of itself. But I'll get to that in just a moment. I'm talking about, of course, the UN Global Digital Compact, which is effectively a collection of underlining the existing human rights law and principles and applying those to the online space. And as I mentioned before, I am, of course, coming to you from the Human Rights Law Centre. Thank you. If we can go to the next slide, please. So, as I mentioned already, there are many benefits to being online, and the UN Global Digital Compact, as I mentioned before, and as you'll be able to see in the chat, I won't sort of explain it too much. You'll be able to read it yourself, and I really do encourage you to absolutely read it. But as I mentioned before, we know there are many perils of being online. Of course, unregulated artificial intelligence. The normalization of surveillance, particularly online, has already been mentioned. Some deep privacy challenges, in particular from these private corporations that are not necessarily bound by the laws of the countries in which they operate. Of course, you have things like cyberbullying and hate and gendered violence. And of course, one that comes up time and time and again, particularly around the context of elections, mis and disinformation. Now, I want to be very clear that I know, of course, that these issues are not new. And the Global Compact acknowledges that, except maybe probably, artificial intelligence, where no one was really talking about AI even 2 years ago, whereas now it's all we talk about. But these problems have been given a new dimension online. And I'm going to, the Global Compact touches on a whole lot of them, but I'm actually really only going to focus on one, and that is mis and disinformation. But before I do that, if we can go to the next slide, please. I want to talk about human rights law in particular, and as it applies to digital kind of technology and our online spaces. I sometimes have a little bit of trouble with the word digital rights, not because it's not a good word or a good combination of words, but because sometimes I think that it implies that there are rights that apply only online and there are rights that apply in the analog world. And human rights law just holds that all of the rights that you have as a human being apply everywhere you are, including the online spaces. But it has been reported that very, very few regulatory frameworks for, say, tech platforms or technology or technological advancements, very few of them actually use human rights law as their foundation. And that is a shame because human rights law and principles actually provide a ready-made, globally accepted framework on which to underpin digital regulation. There is no such thing as a hierarchy with human rights. Human rights come as a package. And human rights law recognizes that sometimes infringing on someone's right is necessary to protect someone else's. Human rights law provides the way to balance these competing rights so that there is a just application, regardless of whether you're trying to do it online or offline. So the human rights treaties that Australia is a signatory to, and these were drafted well before even the existence of the internet. But all of those rights still apply online. And if you look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, for example, Article 17, which is about the right to privacy, Article 19 about the freedom of expression, and Article 25 about political participation and protecting that. Those rights are still relevant regardless of whether you're online or off. But as we know, these technological giants, particularly the bigger companies, you've got Meta, Facebook, let's just call it Facebook because that's what it's called. You've got Facebook and Twitter. Again, let's call it Twitter because that's what it's called. And all the others, they're actually these enormous companies that actually have, in terms of financing and in terms of the ability to shape the information that we use to form our beliefs, that they actually rival governments and I think exceed governments in their ability to have this power, and they absolutely do wield it. But with going back to the global compact, it is basically just an underlining of international law and how digital regulation has to be underpinned by human rights law. But the problem here, as you probably have started to notice, is that international human rights law actually binds governments. It doesn't necessarily bind companies. It doesn't mean that human rights law is ignorant about the role of companies. There are standards that companies are expected to follow, but we know that they don't, and particularly these big digital platforms. Now, the compact says that digital cooperation has to be anchored in international human rights law, as I've mentioned already. But as I've also already mentioned, we are not doing that. Very, very few regulatory frameworks use human rights law. Often they rely on things like ethics and the ethical use of technology. The problem with ethics is that ethics on its own is unenforceable. You need law to enforce ethics. And coming up with a determination of what is ethical varies from person to person, let alone from country to country. Human rights law already has this framework, we're just not using it. And if we go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned already, the benefits of technology are many. If we wouldn't be able to have this conversation if it wasn't for technology. And the UN Compact acknowledges that, and it's not ignorant of that. And it actually it's hoping to facilitate the development and the innovation of technology, but in a way that is safe. But as I've already mentioned, there are many, many harms to being online, and I'll focus about mis and disinformation more broadly. Now, mis and disinformation distorts public debate and it erodes public trust in democracy, but I think it also erodes public trust in any source of information. Because if you cannot believe that what you are reading is true, you just start thinking that anything that you read could be a lie. And this sort of mis and disinformation, certainly as we saw in Australia during the Voice referendum, where racist lies were peddled to try to influence an election outcome, mis and disinformation disproportionately affects marginalized communities, or indeed kind of communities that we know are vulnerable to these types of things, like women, for example, women online. Now, the problem with mis and disinformation, on top of what I've already mentioned, is that the platforms actually profit from the outrage. There is no commercial incentive for them to stop, say, or tweak their algorithms to exploit our engagement on their platform for their profit. Remember, the platforms are they're not focused on accuracy, they're focused on profit that is theirs. Now, Australia once led in digital regulation, but we now lag behind. And in fact, very recently, we tried to do something about misinformation in our parliament that failed spectacularly because of this, in fact, because of misinformation about the misinformation measure. And I'll talk about that later to highlight the difficulty in using some of these global instruments. And I think a difficulty that is inherent in these global instruments more broadly. But if we go to the next slide, please, as I've mentioned already, the UN Global Compact has a lot. And I don't want you to think in any way that I am critical of the compact. I am very, very supportive of it. It is a very good document, and you should read it if you haven't already. It touches on a number of domains, but for the purpose of mis and disinformation right now, the compact says that governments have to commit to promoting science-based, fact-check, multilingual information. But it also just encourages the platforms. Remember, human rights law at that level cannot force the platforms to do anything, but it encourages them to make sure that they improve transparency and also how their algorithms work and how they use our data. There are also calls for user empowerment through media literacy, which of course is a very good thing, but not just media literacy across the board, but media literacy that is targeted, say that it is in for multicultural communities, that there are particularly focuses on First Nations communities or women to uplift their knowledge and also what they can do and the things that they can rely on to have safer experiences online. And importantly, it endorses the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. But this, again, is only a recommendation because the companies are actually not bound by these things because they are companies, they're not nation states. The compact, if anything, is a starting point. It sets a standard, but in and of itself, it cannot be a solution. And I'll explain why on the next slide. Thank you. Now, the compact has a 2030 deadline. All of the commitments have to kind of be achieved or be very well in train but in 5 years' time. But there isn't a clear roadmap or benchmarks, and there's certainly no ability to enforce these things. It is ultimately a voluntary kind of agreement. And in many ways, it's actually for good reason. If it contained these things, I don't think a country would have signed up to it or endorsed it. That's also not how these instruments work at the international level. So that's a difficulty of having a voluntary set of standards. It doesn't matter how good they are, ultimately, they are voluntary. And where countries are not on equal footing on even being able to implement them, because countries have, say, different levels of income, you also kind of run into a difficulty where many countries might want to endorse these things and implement them, but they might lack the financial ability to do so. Again, back to my point that this also really applies only to nation states, not to corporations. And it's actually the corporations, the big tech companies that are driving the problem of mis and disinformation online. Meta has not meaningfully changed these practices despite being implicated in atrocities like the Rohingya genocide. In fact, you could have argued that actually they're going backwards in regards to the recent announcements that they made about fact-checking on their platforms. Also, the Global Compact, despite being a very good document, can actually fall down in domestic implementation for reasons that the Global Compact can't really influence, that is domestic politics. Now, Australia had a 2024 bill about combating mis and disinformation, which I think was a modest effort. It was a little flawed, but it could have been improved. And that bill would have actually aligned itself with the compact, and it could have brought Australia to advancing a lot of the things that are in the compact, but the bill was derailed by domestic politics. Yes, it had flaws, but shelving it entirely leaves a regulatory vacuum that the platforms are actually probably really delighted by. So the Global Compact can't really do much about domestic politics. And it's the domestic politics where these things are going to be implemented to then be reported on the global level. Now, again, I just want to be really clear, just in summary, that of course I do support the Compact. It is a very, very good document. But it is, I suppose, a wish list of the things that we should do. But as is a natural limitation of these types of initiatives, if we don't do them, there are no penalties for that either. But what I think the document does do is that it actually gives us a standard to lobby and to advocate, whether we are lawyers or academics or diplomats or civil society or actually just anybody. And that's the good thing about the compact. It actually drives a sense of urgency, and no one at all can say that this problem is too big and that we have no solutions. We do have a solution. It is in the compact. The thing is that the compact is a tool. And just like any tool, how we use it is actually what's going to matter the most. If we go to the last slide, please, the next slide. I don't want you to feel dejected in any way. I want to reiterate that the UN Compact is a very good thing. We can't view it as a solution on its own. It is a tool for us to lobby at our local, national, international, regional level for the solutions that it demands. It's a very good tool, but like any tool, how we use it will determine its impact. Now, at the Centre, we've done a lot of work on embedding human rights into digital regulation. And the QR code on your screen, if you scan that, you'll be able to download our report, which is called Rights First. And it actually outlines the principles that have to guide digital platform regulation. You could actually apply these to guide the regulation of other types of technologies like AI. You will not be surprised to know that the very first principle is that human rights law has to be the foundation of any regulatory framework. It also proposes a digital duty of care, independent oversight of enforcement, and really strong enforcement powers. Now, this builds on the Compact's ideas, but turns them into what we think is an actionable regulatory steps. Now, platforms in particular, with regards to mis and disinformation, have to be required, not asked, to act in the public interest. And in our report, you can see how we propose for that to happen. Thank you so much, and I'll cede the floor back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for a very comprehensive explanations about what we can actually expect from the digital compact that just recently being adopted by the UN last year. And as David mentioned, of course, there's always a weaknesses when it comes to the form, because as a compact, it's non-legally binding instrument in terms of, trying to force parties to abide for that norm contained in it. But as the more important is, as David said, it's a tool, and the way we are going to the extent it's going to be fruitful, beneficial for people, depends on how we use it, as David said, because all the norm we need to push forward is already in it in the compact. And the last slide is very interesting. Perhaps people would like to also try to see that and to look into that, because it touched the discussion on the accountability of the corporate, especially digital platform that influence and have much power to shape the flow of the information, the type of informations that people have online. And as David said, across Southeast Asia region, there is also a similar situations in which the government feels like there is very little laws actually try to regulate digital platform operation across Southeast Asia countries. So now I'm going to look into the chat. We have some of the comments from the participants. I think, as David mentioned, one of the threat is about disinformations and misinformations. We have a comment from Sevanaya Tuikau. Apologize if I am misspell the name. She said that misinformation and disinformation was also evidence in Fiji last national elections. The second comment comes from Pervas that said that misinformation and disinformations also impact in Bangladesh in last July movement. So I think the two comments coming out from the floor is actually worth discussing and responding by two distinguished speakers that we have, because I think, as Nenden said, disinformation and misinformation is also one of the threat that put the risk of the democratic online space in Southeast Asia region. So I would like to invite both David and Nenden to also respond this, as well as for Nenden, perhaps you can add more on how to respond what David said about the prospect of digital compact. To what extent this actually give a hope to right defender in Southeast Asia to address the challenge that you talk about. Please.
Okay, maybe I'll go first. So thank you, Indri. So yeah, I mean, like, misinformation and disinformation is also give quite bad influence in Indonesia in the last election as well. And then we can see on how AI and another technology advancements is also make the situation worse. And then and I believe I think there's no such country that already have this kind of like AI regulations, and on how, I mean, like, it's still talking about ethics, and then on how we can use the AI for economic advancement or anything and so on. So this is something that we should look for. And then actually the digital compacts maybe give us hope on how can become like kind of like guidelines on how the government can create some like regulation that possibly can make the situation better, even though we know that on the global this compact is also have a lot of like criticism, right, on how, yes, David actually already mentioned how it's not legally binding, and on how the intention or even the words that used on the compact is, it's actually people, some activists also thinking it can erode the right itself. So this is something that maybe we should looking for any kind of, some loophole, for example, and then we can see find any opportunities, and then how we can like, as David mentioned earlier, how we can use it as a tool to advocate things to the government, for example, and how at least we can mention that we have this GDC, and then you should like maybe look for it on how you regulate something, and then yeah, maybe that's something that we should find any kind of like, I don't know, like kind of any opportunities on that, even though we know that it's not perfect. But yeah, maybe if there's any kind of like opportunity for us to give any other recommendation to make this compact more even better, I think this is something that we should look for the opportunity to advocating this. But at least for now, yeah, we can use it as tools at least to talk to the government, right, on how they should like regulate the digital space, or even the AI and another technology advancements, to ensure and to uphold human rights when they're trying to regulate that. So yeah, maybe that's my initial response on the comments and on the GDC. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nenden. I think it's a good point. So I think one first step would be to make people aware about this, right, defenders. And as you said, despite all the weaknesses, we still can use that to speak to the government and bring up the sense of urgency, as David said. Now, I would like to give floor to David, please.
Thank you, Indri, and thank you, Nenden. You're absolutely correct. I guess for answering the question from like a human rights point of view, the freedom of expression, the right to speak your mind, isn't limited to you just saying things that are true. The freedom of expression even protects things that are lies, and even things that are probably really offensive. And mis and disinformation has existed since we've had information. But I think the platforms themselves and the fundamental features of the platforms, like the algorithms, the data collection, is what actually makes the problem worse. And particularly as it's been mentioned already in Fiji and Bangladesh, how it actually impacts elections, because you also have the right to vote, and the right to vote also means the right to receive information that is correct and accurate about the electoral process, and also about the people you're going to vote for. That's why in the report, and you'll see it in the chat, the report that we wrote, we recommend for something like a duty of care, that we think that the big platforms actually have a duty of care to their users to make sure that their products are safe. And that also includes assessing their algorithms to make sure that the algorithms are not spreading mis and disinformation like wildfire, and that there are some checks and balances on these things. And we think that this type of regulation of a duty of care is actually a more human rights respecting way of regulating mis and disinformation. Because once you start regulating content, like individual pieces of content, you start running into questions about censorship and about the freedom of expression. But if you actually regulate the systems that are making this content go viral, then you actually get into a different kind of conversation. You're actually trying to prevent people from harm, as opposed to trying to say what you can and cannot say on the internet. The Digital Services Act in the European Union takes this approach, and it's just started. So we're just getting some really good data from it now. And I would encourage folks to read up on how the Digital Services Act does this. But I would also just say as well that going to Nenden's point about making sure that activists know about the compact, civil society organizations can sign up to endorse the compact. It's not just nation states. So the Human Rights Law Center is considering signing on, and you can see that a whole lot of civil society organizations and activists have endorsed it. So it is another tool to get knowledge about the compact, but also use it to pressure our governments into implementing it.
Okay, thank you, David. One last point is very interesting for us that actually it's not only state that can sign into it, but we as a civil society organization and right defender can actually also join in to give more, kind of like strength for us, promote that tool to strengthen our advocacy. Now I will be back to the chat box, and I would like to read some of the comment and questions. And for this round, I think it's going to be the last round for us, for the speaker to comment. So when you comment this also, please make sure it's becoming your closing remarks for the discussion. Apologize for participant because we have a very limited time this time. So I'm going to start with a question from Patrick. Do the speaker have a sense of how much the compact is being used by the right defenders or movements in their advocacy to companies or governments or awareness building, and how much government are using this in their regulatory effort? I think both speaker can respond to it. And then there's a comment from Budi Kamarat. Thanks to David and Nenden, because both of your speech are very useful inside. And then there is also another question from Nisa. 2030 deadline seems too soon. How are human rights groups campaigning for that GDC? And do they prefer a next one, or do they want an extensions? Again from Patrick. Patrick would like to know if implementation of GDC is coming up to the recommendation of UN treaty bodies or special procedures or UPR, because that's the arena that most of human rights defenders are now working on, I think. And then there's another question from Luis. I think this is the last one, or the second last one. Would David like to comment on the Australian government's voluntary AI safety standard and proposed mandatory guardrails? Will this be strong enough, or should we continue to advocate for appropriate legislation? This is a specific question for David on Australia. Is there any collective consultative mechanism in place on commenting on the Global Compact? A question from Emma Duetti from Pacific Island Councils. So please feel free to respond to that. Perhaps may not be able to do it one by one. And also becoming your closing remark for this.
Okay,
Please,
I'll go first.
perhaps Nenden can go
Okay.
first, yeah?
Okay, so actually one of the criticism against the GDC is actually about the current process is lack of meaningful participation from the civil society actually. So this is something that when Patrick questioning about how it's actually rights defenders knows about it, actually it's quite actually for the organization that working on the digital space, this is everyone knows about this, but there's the criticism around that. So this is something that we should see is as a problem that we should try to improve. Yeah. So on how we should extend or even to expand the GDC itself to ensure the meaningful participation, on how we can put more recommendation related to the, for example, the accountability mechanism itself, and then embedding the global south perspective, because another criticism is really global north perspective on the GDC. So on how we can put this global south perspective is something that quite important. And then yeah, and how we should democratizing the process as well, to ensure that more perspective, more stakeholders that involved in this process, in the process. So when we're talking, is it the timeline around 2030 or 2040? I think we're not talking about the timeline, but on how we can aim the goal to ensure that the digital space is like regulated and upholds the human rights. Actually, that's the goal. So when we're talking about the timeline, I don't think it's something that I don't say it's like not important, but actually as long as we can reach the goals is something that we should aim. Yeah, so not about the timeline. So that's the thing actually, to democratizing the process of the GDC itself. So this is something that uh critical, yeah, if we really want to ensure that the GDC can be applied in across the globe, even for the rights defender itself. So yeah, so my last statement actually, when we're talking about the digital rights, the GDC, or any kind of like framework that that talking about the digital space, is it always important to make it more inclusive? You know, like even though the technology mostly developed by a global north perspective, but on how we can also, you know, involve the global south community, make the space for them to give their perspective, to make how they feel about it, on what kind of recommendation they give, to ensure that this is will be the really a better and improve frameworks to ensure the goal to as a, yeah, to ensure and to make the goals on how this framework can help us as a guideline on regulated digital space that you know, like that truly inclusive and also upholds human rights. Yeah, that's maybe from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to David, there is one additional comment in the chat from Tom Kalma. That is, legislative room should also include civic and human rights educations with a specific initiative to empower our youth and young people to be more discerning to questions the accuracy of social media posting. I think this is also another point, because youth are actually the proportion of youth accessing social media and internet are increasingly growing in Southeast Asia country with very little safeguard regulatory framework for them. Please, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree any more with that, Professor Karma. Absolutely, and any of this sort of information that we give to young people, or indeed to anyone, has to, of course, be culturally competent and sensitive and age appropriate, and all of those things. But that has to go hand in hand with the regulation. I'm going to try to combine all of the questions and also just give some brief statements, just in closing. But I guess with the timeline, yes, of course, 2030 is very short, but the technology is developing at a much faster rate. And we also have to kind of note that the compact has to be read in conjunction with the development goals, with the ICCPR, the UPR processes. So in and of itself, it does have some very short timeframes, but it also is part of a larger narrative that has to kind of also be considered. The AI safety standards in Australia are actually not too bad, but they need to kind of constantly be evolving. And the compact actually provides a framework to be able to do that in a way that makes sense. Because it's not just about regulating technology, it's also about how we as nation states and we as civil society share information about best practices. How do we have joint standards? Because as we know, the internet is global. So a global cooperation is required. And that actually is probably the bulk of the compact. How do we make sure that we can cooperate across borders, across towns, across cities, and even across houses? Now, how much of it is already being advanced? A fair bit of it is being advanced by civil society, by academia, by conversations like these ones. But I want to go back and in kind of conclusion and wrapping up all of my points is that these tools are just that, they are tools. How we hold them and how we use them is actually going to be a bigger marker of how successful they are or could be than the text themselves. So I don't want you to think that in and of itself it is a solution. It isn't. It is a solution if we use it and advance it locally, at the regional level, in partnership with each other and in partnership across sectors. I have heard once that every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. And I think the same applies for the Global Compact. It is a solution on paper, but if it's actually going to be a solution in practice, that's really up to us. But the one thing it absolutely does do is that it actually just highlights that there is a solution. No one can say that this problem is too big, that it is beyond our ability to legislate or regulate because it's so new or novel. None of that is true. There is a solution. The thing is, it's now up to us, civil society, human rights defenders, lawyers, doctors, nurses, cleaners, everybody, to actually use it and demand that our governments implement it and also call on other governments to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for a very sharp wrapping up. That also implies what the homework that we need to do in regard to the GDC. So before I think today's discussion are very rich to also touch upon the situation on the ground in regard to digital rights situation in Southeast Asia country, as well as possibilities available at the global level with the DDC, and to what extent we can actually advance and use that as a tool to strengthen the advocacy of right defenders. Before we end up these discussions, I would like to invite Patrick Earl from the DTP, the Executive Director of DTP, to give 1 or 2 minutes to close these discussions. Please, Patrick.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Indri, and thank you, Nenden and David. I'm going to pass over actually to Claire to say thank you on behalf of DTP, because she's really done all the work to make this possible. But just to say, this is the beginning of our work in this area. We recognise its importance, and I think you've got us all off to a terrific start in thinking about how do we develop knowledge and understanding of the Global Compact as a tool, but also what is the tool responding to, and how do we fix the problems that are emerging in this space. So thank you very much to everyone. And Claire, did you want to say some words on behalf of DTP to thank everybody and talk about next steps?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Patrick. And thanks for summarizing that up really well. On behalf of DTP, I'd like to thank Nenden, David, and Indri for their time today and for such thoughtful and informative sessions and discussions. It was a really good webinar. It was really informative, and it was great engagement with the participants. And so thank you very much for all of your time in preparing and delivering the content today. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us today and being so engaged in the topic and posting your questions and comments in the chat. We're taking all of them on board as well, and you'll shortly be sent an evaluation survey by email, and so we'll take on board all of your feedback. As Patrick said, this is just the beginning of our work on digital rights. We're starting off with a series of 3 webinars on the topic, and this is the first one. We'll be having the second 2 over the next couple of weeks, and so we will email you when registrations for that become available, and also there'll be information about it in our e-news, which you're all subscribed to. So there will be a recording. This webinar was recorded. Shortly, I will send a copy of the recording, the PowerPoint presentations, as well as all of the resources that were shared in the chat, as well as some additional resources that we've got for you. So that will be sent around by email to everyone that registered sometime over the next couple of days. And there's nothing much else for us to do except to conclude. So thank you very much for all of your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.